Eleanor Roosevelt, author, activist, humanitarian. As First Lady, a staunch, relentless, and compassionate voice for the poor, the underprivileged, the segregated, the wounded, the forgotten. As delegate to the United Nations, she guided the development of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Eleanor Roosevelt, widely regarded as the most influential woman of the 20th century, was, at times, humorous.
Last year, during the presidential re-election campaign, Franklin's campaign manager, Mr. Jim Farley, just wanted to keep me in a box. What with the Republicans coming up with those buttons that said, "We don't want Eleanor either."
At times, self-effacing.
My job? I have no qualifications for my job. First Lady. Why can't someone have this job who'd like it and do something worthwhile with it?
She was inspirational.
Time and again, I was reminded how dire necessity brings out the best in people.
And often visionary.
Achieving these human rights within our borders is as important to world peace as having more military power or more economic power, because many peoples in the world today are trying to decide which form of governance truly offers them the best future.
Behind this public life is the story of a little girl who lost both parents before the age of 10, a debutante who felt trapped by society's expectations, and a young wife who raised 5 children before emerging as one of America's most significant women. In a moment, we will meet Susan Marie Fronczak, creator and presenter of these living history portrayals. You'll also learn how these programs and their messages can benefit your organization. But first, let's take a closer look at 3 windows into Mrs. Roosevelt's life. Eleanor Roosevelt's public life spanned many decades. You get to choose among 3 programs to meet this remarkable woman. The first program takes place during the Great Depression.
I have been asked to recount some episodes from my autobiography. I will comply. However, you must know that the world is a much wiser place today in 1937 than it was when I was a little girl. In fact, one of the things that I've been most grateful for in these years of the Depression is that we know so many things that we...
The second program is set during World War II.
My goals with this trip were threefold. First, to reach out in moral support to our Allied neighbors who are bearing the brunt of Hitler's attacks. Second, to learn from the women of England how they are accomplishing so much, so that we might set up similar support in the United States for our women who are taking on so many new roles. And third, at my husband's request, to take a message to our servicemen, many of whom are even now fighting in North Africa.
And the third program occurs during her years at the United Nations.
I have a challenge for you this evening. I am going to ask you to step forward and take more responsibility in the cause of human rights.
Each of the 3 programs stands alone, or they can be hosted in sequence. Let's take a closer look at each program. The Great Depression program is set during her husband's second term as president in the unfolding years of the New Deal.
The Social Security bill is a start, but it only protects about half of our country's workers and not those who need it most. I think we may get a national minimum wage passed next year. I'm very troubled about what's happening in Spain. And here in the United States, we still have no anti-lynching law.
Through a series of vignettes, witness alternating glimpses into Eleanor Roosevelt's public and private personae.
Elizabeth, I shall miss our Air Our Minds luncheons while I'm away. What a safeguard it is to have friends like you and Francis Perkins, whom I can speak to with absolute sincerity and with no danger of having the rest of the world hear anything about it. I liked that group at the community college this evening. Such nice young people. Who is it first tomorrow? Ah, the Jewish Women's Federation, of course. Well, I don't care if the papers do complain. Franklin won't let me speak about what's happening in Germany. The least I can do is to show by example that we can respect one another within the United States.
Learn about the turmoil of her childhood and how she overcame her insecurities.
I was conscious of their pity, for my looks fell so far below the family standard, and I had no special talents of any kind to compensate for my looks. I became convinced I had nothing to offer the world and would only ever be a burden to others. But my teacher...
Hear Mrs. Roosevelt's views on how you can make a difference in the midst of a strife-filled world. Views at least as relevant today as there were over 7 decades ago.
Perhaps you will tell me that you live in a small place or have but little influence. This is not so.
The second window into Eleanor Roosevelt's life and times is set during World War II. Find out how the First Lady feels about the individual's role in a world torn by war, hardship, and uncertainty.
Before I tell you about my recent trip to England, I want to spend a few minutes with you thinking about why it is we are fighting this war and what we are fighting for.
This program instills a profound appreciation of sacrifices made.
But his hands were so badly burned at Pearl Harbor. They were just one scar on top of another.
While celebrating forward strides in racial equality.
Until very recently, Negro servicemen were not allowed to learn how to pilot an aeroplane. However, last year, I had the opportunity to visit Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. At my request, I was taken on a flight by Chief Anderson, the first colored gentleman to earn his pilot's license. I can confirm that the...
And gender equality.
I am concerned that many women are only being paid 2/3 as much as men in the same positions. But with the War Labor Board's recent ruling on equal pay for equal work, it is my hope.
The third program is set during her years at the United Nations.
The United Nations was established in response to the devastation of the Second World War, a war that cost the world over 60 million lives, the majority of which were civilian lives, and continues to wreak havoc in the lives of many people and the economies of many nations today.
This program addresses what Eleanor Roosevelt considered her greatest achievement, chairing the committee that created the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a groundbreaking, grueling, tempestuous, and eventually triumphant process that resulted in a Magna Carta for humankind.
Well, I found out why it is so difficult. It is far easier to start a war than it is to negotiate a peace. It is much more work to build understanding than it is to pick a fight.
As with the first 2 programs, along the way we gain insights into Eleanor Roosevelt's character.
Just this afternoon, someone asked me how my own background particularly prepared me to work on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The truth is, I had no preparation. I really have no qualifications whatsoever to be a delegate from the United States. I have no legal background. I don't even have a college degree. One of my fellow delegates confirmed my doubts and made it known that he felt negotiating at the United Nations was no place for a woman. Well, then I knew. I had to stop feeling sorry for myself. I had to do better than any of the men delegates, because if I did not, it would not just be held against me, it would be held against all women. Ironically, the reason my fellow delegate eventually stopped criticizing me was because of the strength with which I answered criticism from the Russian delegates on the refugee question. So really, I only traded one kind of criticism for another. That's a qualification I'd never thought of before. I have over 60 years' experience receiving criticism.
A special feature of all three programs is that the audience has an opportunity to converse with Mrs. Roosevelt.
How did you feel when you started to talk in front of the public?
How did I feel when I began speaking in public? Oh, I will tell you, I was terrified. You see, this was after my husband's illness. He was working to regain the use of his legs. And his friend, Louis Howe, told me I must go speak in order to keep his name before the public, the name of Roosevelt. But I will tell you, I would get so nervous that my voice would go up and I'd begin to laugh like this. And then the audience would laugh and I would feel even worse.
Yes.
It's my impression that your husband and Winston Churchill became very good friends during the course of the war. And I wonder what your impression of Churchill is.
My husband and Mr. Churchill are very good friends. They can't be in the same room for 5 minutes together without starting to recite poetry or literature to one another. I will say, recently, Mr. Churchill visited us at Hyde Park. And I cannot agree with his proposal for what should happen after the war. He kept feeding Franklin's ear with a plan for an Anglo-American alliance. Well, that's all very well, but I say that it must include all countries. It must include representatives from every nation around the world if we wish to have a way to settle our differences without recourse to force.
In a moment, we will meet Susan Marie Fronczak, creator and presenter of these living history portrayals.